On the second morning, Paige answered a question that nobody had asked. She was sitting by the dead campfire cross-legged, still in her sleeping bag, holding a tin cup of instant coffee that had gone cold. Dana was rolling up her tent. Britt was brushing her teeth by the creek. Lori was lacing her boots. Nobody was talking. The forest was quiet in that flat, heavy way it gets before rain. No birds, no wind, just the creek running over stones and the sound of nylon being folded. Then Paige looked up from her coffee and said very clearly, "No, I don't think they should go that way." Dana stopped rolling. She looked at Paige. Paige was staring at the tree line to the north, about 40 yards from the campsite, where the birch and maple thinned out and the old-growth spruce began. Her face was calm. Her eyes were focused on something between the trunks that the rest of them couldn't see. Dana said, "What?" Paige blinked. She looked down at her coffee. She said, "What?" back, like the word was a mirror. She didn't remember saying it. She didn't remember looking at the trees. She laughed and said she must have been half asleep, and Dana laughed too, but the laugh was short and dry, and neither of them looked at the spruce line again until they had to. I know all of this because Dana Holloway is my sister. She told me the whole story in my kitchen 3 weeks after they came back, and by then she'd already lost 8 pounds and stopped sleeping with the lights off, and had a bruise on her right hand from punching a wall during a nightmare she couldn't describe. She told me everything. She told me more than I wanted to know. The trip was supposed to be simple. 4 friends, 1 weekend, a campsite at the end of the Polk Creek Trail in the Shawcross State Forest. They'd been planning it since January, a last hurrah before Paige moved to Seattle and the group scattered to different cities and different lives. They were all 24. They'd been friends since freshman year. They knew each other the way you know someone you've argued with at 3 in the morning and forgiven by breakfast. Deeply, messily, completely. The Shawcross is big, 60,000 acres of mixed forest stretching from the county line to the ridge of Barren Mountain. The southern half is managed, marked trails, maintained campsites, ranger stations every few miles. The northern half is not. Past the Polk Creek Junction, the trails fade to deer paths, and the deer paths fade to nothing, and the trees get older and taller and closer together until the canopy blocks out the sky and you're walking through a green tunnel that smells like resin and wet soil and something faintly metallic that you notice but can't place. They hiked in on a Friday. 8 miles, moderate elevation, good trail. The campsite was a flat clearing near the creek with a fire ring made from river stones and a log bench that someone had dragged into position years ago. The creek was clear and fast, running over smooth gray rocks, cold enough to sting. The trees around the clearing were mostly birch, white trunks, peeling bark, leaves just starting to turn in the late September light. Beyond the birch to the north, the spruce began. The spruce was different, darker, denser. The trunks were black with moisture, and the branches started low and grew in thick horizontal shelves that blocked both light and sight. You could stand at the edge of the birch and look into the spruce and see maybe 15 feet before the darkness swallowed everything. The first night was fine. They set up the tents, built a fire, ate pasta cooked on a camp stove. They passed a bottle of whiskey. They told stories. Lori did her impression of their college advisor, and everyone laughed until their stomachs hurt. The fire burned down to coals, and the sky above the clearing was enormous and black and filled with more stars than any of them had seen in years. They went to sleep, happy. Paige woke up at 3 in the morning. Dana knew because they shared a tent, and Dana was a light sleeper, and she felt Paige sit up beside her, slowly, the sleeping bag rustling. Dana opened one eye. Paige was sitting upright, her head tilted slightly to the left, listening. Dana whispered her name. Paige didn't answer. She sat like that for maybe 3 minutes, completely still, and then she lay back down and pulled the sleeping bag over her shoulder and was asleep again in seconds. In the morning, she didn't remember waking up. Then came the second morning. The coffee. The sentence aimed at nobody. And after that, things started to move faster. They spent the day hiking north. Paige wanted to see the old spruce. She was insistent in a way that was unusual for her. Paige was normally the flexible one, the go-along to get-along member of the group. But that morning she had a direction and a purpose, and she led them into the spruce line and down a slope and along a ravine that cut through the forest like a wound. The ravine was steep-sided and narrow, maybe 10 feet across at the bottom, with a trickle of dark water running through it. The spruce grew right up to the edge, and their roots hung over the sides like fingers gripping a ledge. The air at the bottom was cold and damp and smelled like iron. The light was dim. Not twilight, not shadow, but a quality of light that felt filtered, as if it had passed through something before reaching them, something that had taken some of the warmth out. Paige walked ahead. She didn't hesitate. She moved through the ravine like she'd been there before, ducking under branches, stepping over roots, choosing the right path at every fork without pausing. Dana watched her and felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, not yet, but the space where fear would go, cleared and waiting. After about 2 miles, they found the camp. Not their camp, an old one, a dead one. It was in a small, flat area where the ravine widened slightly, and it had been there for a long time. The tent was collapsed, green nylon, faded to gray, half buried in spruce needles. The poles were still connected but bent, twisted into shapes that didn't match any tent design Dana had ever seen. There was a cookpot, blackened and dented, sitting upright next to the remains of a fire ring. The fire ring was cold. Not recently cold. Years cold. Decades cold. The ashes were compacted and hard, mixed with dirt and needles, and small plants were growing through them. Inside the collapsed tent, Paige lifted the fabric before anyone could stop her. There was a sleeping bag. The sleeping bag was zipped closed, and it was not empty. It was flat, the way a sleeping bag looks when someone is lying in it, pressed against the fabric from the inside. But the shape was wrong. Too long, too narrow. The proportions didn't match a human body. Whatever was in there had either been a very strange person or had become something else after the zipper closed. Nobody touched it, not even Paige. But Paige squatted beside it and tilted her head again, that same leftward tilt from 3 in the morning, and she said softly, "They didn't leave in time." Laurie said, "What?" Brid said, "Who?" Dana said nothing. She grabbed Paige's arm and pulled her up and said, "We're going back." Paige looked at her, and her eyes were wrong. Not clouded, not glazed, but deep. Deeper than eyes should be. As if something behind them was looking through from a long way back. They walked back to their campsite in silence. That night, none of them slept well. The forest was louder than the night before, not with identifiable sounds, not with animals or wind, but with a low, continuous presence that sat just below hearing. A vibration, a pressure in the ears, like standing next to a machine that's running in a room you can't see. At 2 in the morning, Laurie woke up and Paige was gone. Paige's sleeping bag was flat. The tent zipper was open. Her boots were inside the tent, unlaced, side by side. Dana woke up when Laurie said her name, and the 3 of them went outside, and the clearing was lit by a half moon that made the birch trunks glow white and the spruce line black. And in the black, about 30 yards in, they could see a light. Not a flashlight, not a fire. A pale, cool light, like the screen of a phone held at arm's length, except it wasn't concentrated. It was diffuse. It moved. It drifted between the trunks like something alive. They called Paige's name. No answer. They called again. The light stopped moving. It hung in the darkness between two spruces, motionless. And then it went out. Not faded. Out. Like a switch. Dana ran. She ran into the spruce line with her flashlight and her boots untied and the branches clawing at her face, and she found Paige about 50 yards in, standing in the ravine, barefoot, in her t-shirt and shorts, her arms at her sides, her head tilted to the left, staring at the collapsed tent. The tent was different. The nylon was pulled taut. The poles were straight. The zipper was open. The sleeping bag was empty. Dana grabbed Paige and pulled her backward, and Paige resisted, not with strength, but with weight, as if gravity was working harder on her, pulling her down and forward into the ravine. And Dana screamed her name into her face, and Paige's eyes snapped into focus, and she gasped like someone coming up from underwater, and looked around and said, "Where am I?" They packed in the dark, flashlights shaking, hands fumbling with tent poles and zippers. The forest pressing in on every side, the spruce line a wall of black, and from somewhere inside it, from the direction of the ravine, from the direction of the old camp, that low vibration, rising, not louder, closer. They hiked out in 3 hours, in the dark. Lori fell twice. Britt cut her palm on a rock. Dana held Paige's hand the entire way, and Paige let her, and didn't speak, and her hand was cold. So cold. Like she'd been holding it in creek water for an hour. They reached the parking lot at dawn. They drove home. They never went back. Paige moved to Seattle the next week, on schedule, as if nothing had happened. She calls Dana every Sunday. The conversations are normal. They talk about work and weather and the small machinery of daily life. But Dana told me something that she hasn't told the others. She said that when she found Paige in the ravine, standing over that empty sleeping bag, Paige was talking, quietly, under her breath. She was having a conversation with someone Dana couldn't see, and the voice Paige was using wasn't her own. It was lower, older. It shaped the words differently, slower, with pauses in strange places, as if the mouth producing the sounds was learning how to form them, as if something that had been lying in that sleeping bag for a very long time was remembering what it felt like to speak. Dana doesn't go camping anymore. She locks her doors at night. She sleeps with a lamp on. And sometimes, she says, around 2 or 3 in the morning, when the apartment is dark and the street is quiet, she hears Paige's voice. Not through the wall, not through a phone. Inside her head, behind her ears, calm and clear and patient. It says, "They didn't leave in time." Dana doesn't know who they were. She's afraid she's about to find out. The fire wouldn't stay dead. That's the part of the story that still makes my hands shake, even now, even in daylight, even with the radio on and the coffee hot and the world doing its best to feel normal. Because you can explain a lot of things in the woods. You can explain sounds. You can explain shadows. You can explain the feeling of being watched. That's just your lizard brain doing its job, scanning the dark for predators that aren't there anymore. But you can't explain a campfire that you drown and bury and stomp flat and then find burning again an hour later in a ring of stones you didn't build, in a part of the forest you've never been to, with flames that don't give off heat. Claire and Amy Whitfield were sisters. Claire was 27, Amy was 23. They grew up in Dunmore, a mill town on the Nesset River, and they'd been camping together since they were kids. Their father used to take them out to the Blackstone Reservoir every June, the 3 of them in a canvas tent that leaked when it rained, and they'd fish all day and burn marshmallows all night and fall asleep to the sound of the water and the fire. After their father died, that was 4 years ago, heart attack, 58 years old, the sisters kept the tradition going. Every June, one weekend, somewhere new. This year they chose the Cranberry Flats in the Ochre National Forest, about 100 miles north of Dunmore. The flats were a wide, marshy valley between two ridges, cut through by a shallow creek, bordered on three sides by spruce and balsam fir. The campsite was primitive, no picnic table, no fire grate, just a flat patch of gravel near the creek with a clearing big enough for 2 tents. The nearest road was 7 miles south. The nearest other campers, according to the ranger at the trailhead, were at least 4 miles east. They hiked in on a Saturday morning in late June. The weather was warm and overcast, the sky the color of old wool, and the air smelled like pine sap and damp earth and the faint sweetness of the balsam fir, which is a smell that stays in your clothes and your hair and follows you home. The trail was easy, flat, well-marked, mostly dry. They reached the flats by early afternoon and set up camp, and it was good. It was the way it was supposed to be. Just the two of them, the creek, the trees, the sky. They built a fire around 6. Claire gathered the wood, dead birch, dry, the bark peeling off in white curls. Amy built the ring from river stones, the way their father had taught them. Stones spaced evenly, a gap on the windward side for airflow. The fire caught easily and burned well, and they cooked hot dogs on sharpened sticks and ate canned beans and split a 6-pack of beer and watched the light fade from the sky and felt, for the first time in a long time, like things were going to be all right. They put the fire out at 10. Claire poured water from the pot. Amy kicked dirt over the coals. The fire hissed and smoked and went dark, and they watched it die and went to their tents and zipped up and fell asleep. Amy woke up at midnight. She didn't know why, no sound, no dream, just an abrupt, full wakefulness, as if someone had tapped her on the shoulder. She lay in the dark for a minute, listening. The creek, wind in the firs, silence. Then she smelled smoke. She unzipped the tent and looked out. The campfire was burning. The ring of stones, the same ring she'd built 4 hours ago, was full of flame. Low, steady, the kind of fire that's been burning for a while and has found its rhythm. The wood was fresh. Not the birch they'd burned earlier, something darker, thicker, bark still on. She didn't recognize the species. She woke Claire. They stood at the edge of the fire ring and stared. Claire touched the stones. They were hot. She held her hand over the flames and pulled it back. Real fire. Real heat. Real smoke climbing into the dark sky in a gray thread. But they hadn't built it. The fire they'd put out had been dead, soaked, buried, cold. This was a different fire, with different wood, in the same stones. Claire poured the rest of their water on it. It took a while. The coals were deep, packed tight, hotter than they should have been for a fire that had apparently started on its own. Steam billowed up, and the smoke thickened, and Claire coughed, and Amy covered her face, and when the steam cleared, the fire was out. Dead. Black. They went back to bed. Neither slept. In the morning, the fire ring was cold and grey and full of wet ash. Normal. They ate granola bars and drank instant coffee and talked about it in the careful, rational way that people talk about things they can't explain. Probably an ember survived, Claire said, under the dirt. Found some dry wood that blew in, rekindled. It happens. Amy nodded. She wanted to believe it. She needed to believe it. Because the alternative, That something in this valley was building fires in their camp while they slept was a thought she couldn't hold in her head without her hands starting to shake. They spent the day at the creek. They walked upstream. The valley narrowed and the ridges closed in and the creek ran faster, cutting through dark rock, and the firs on either side grew taller and older, their lowest branches brushing the water. It was beautiful. It was exactly what they'd come for. They turned back around 3 and found the second fire. It was not at their campsite. It was about 100 yards east, in a small depression between 2 balsam firs, in a ring of stones that neither of them had built. The stones were different from theirs, darker, rougher, arranged in a tighter circle. The fire was low and steady, burning the same dark wood as the one from the night before. No one was near it. No one was anywhere. Amy wanted to leave. Claire said no. She said they were being rational. She said someone else was camping in the area, someone the ranger hadn't mentioned, someone with a different schedule, someone who built fires and left them unattended. It was irresponsible but not mysterious. She put the fire out. She used creek water, 3 trips with the pot. The coals resisted. They spit and crackled and turned red again after each dousing, as if the fire was being fed from below, from some source the water couldn't reach. But eventually, it died. Claire kicked dirt over it. She scattered the stones. That night, they didn't build a fire of their own. They ate cold food. They sat in the dark and watched the stars and didn't talk much. The forest was quiet. Too quiet, Amy thought. The creek was there, steady as always, but the other sounds, the wind, the distant rustle of animals, the creak of branches settling, were gone. The silence was a physical thing. It pressed against Amy's ears and filled her head, and she sat in it the way you sit in deep water, aware of the weight of it on all sides. At 1 a.m, Amy smelled smoke. She was in her tent, awake, lying on her back, staring at the nylon ceiling. The smoke was faint at first, a suggestion, a memory, the ghost of a smell. Then it thickened. She could taste it. Not wood smoke, something else. Something sweeter, heavier, with an organic edge that made her think of incense, or dried flowers, or something burning that had once been alive. She opened the tent. 3 fires. 3 separate fires, burning in 3 separate stone rings, arranged in a line that ran from the edge of the campsite into the forest. Each one was about 30 yards apart. The nearest was 15 feet from her tent. The farthest was barely visible, a faint orange glow deep in the firs, flickering against the dark trunks. All 3 burned the same dark wood. All 3 were low and steady and silent. No crackle, no pop, no hiss of sap. Just flame, clean and still, like candles in a church. Between the fires, on the ground, something had been drawn, lines in the dirt, connecting the rings, running from one to the next. Not straight lines, curves, spirals, patterns that caught the firelight and seemed to shift when Amy turned her head, rearranging themselves into shapes that were almost recognizable, but never quite arrived at meaning. Claire was already outside. She was standing at the edge of the nearest fire, looking at the line of flames stretching into the dark, and her face had lost all the careful rationality of the morning. She looked afraid. She looked the way their father used to look when he heard a sound in the woods he couldn't identify. Alert, focused, and one wrong answer away from running. She said, "There are more." Amy looked where Claire was looking, past the 3 fires, into the forest. And she saw them. More glows, deeper in the firs, scattered among the trunks like orange stars fallen to earth. 5, 7. More beyond those, dimmer, further, disappearing into the black, a constellation of small fires, burning in stone rings, stretching away from the campsite in a direction that felt deliberate, that felt like a path. The fires were leading somewhere. Amy grabbed Claire's arm. Claire was walking forward. She'd taken 2 steps toward the nearest fire, and her face had changed again. Not afraid now, but attentive, curious, drawn. The same expression Paige Holloway had worn in a different forest, in a different story, for a different reason, but with the same undertone. Something in the woods was calling, and part of her wanted to answer. Amy pulled her back. Claire resisted for a second, and then the moment broke, and she shook her head and said, "We're leaving." They packed. They left the tents. They left the sleeping bags and the stove and the food and the carefully built stone ring that had started all of this. They hiked 7 miles in the dark, using headlamps, walking fast. Not running, because running would mean admitting that something was behind them, and they weren't ready for that. They reached the trailhead at 4 in the morning. Their car was the only one in the lot. They drove south. The sun came up. The world returned to normal. Roads and gas stations and other cars. The ordinary machinery of a civilization that doesn't burn fires in circles in the dark. But it didn't end. Claire called Amy the next week. She said she'd come home from work, and her apartment smelled like smoke. Not cigarette smoke. Wood smoke. The sweet, heavy kind. The same smell from the flats. She checked the stove. Off. She checked the heating. Off. She opened the windows, and the smell faded, and she told herself it was nothing. The next morning, she found ash on her doorstep. A small pile, dark and fine. The kind that comes from wood burned at high temperature. She swept it away. It came back the next morning. And the next. Every morning, a small, neat pile of ash on her doorstep, as if something was burning a fire outside her door each night and letting it die before dawn. Amy hasn't found ash on her doorstep. Not yet. But she smells it. Every night, around 1 in the morning, she smells that sweet, heavy smoke, and when she goes to the window and looks out at the parking lot behind her building, she sees something. Not a fire, not exactly. A glow. Low and orange and steady, sitting on the asphalt near the tree line at the edge of the lot, in a ring of stones that shouldn't be there. She doesn't go outside to check. She's afraid of what she'd find at the end of the path. Mel heard her own voice calling from the woods at 11:14 on a Saturday night. She was sitting by the fire with the others, Tanya, Joe, Sarah, passing a bag of trail mix and talking about nothing important. And then from somewhere north of the campsite, maybe 100 yards into the pines, she heard someone say her name. Her full name. Melanie. Drawn out the way you'd call someone who was far away and couldn't hear you. Melanie. And the voice was hers. Not similar, not a close match. Hers. Her pitch, her cadence, the way she dropped the second syllable slightly and let the third one rise. She'd heard her own voice on recordings enough times to know it, the way you know your face in a mirror. That was her voice, coming from between the trees, calling her name the way she'd call it herself. She stopped chewing. She looked at the others. Tanya was laughing at something Joe had said. Sarah was poking the fire with a stick. Nobody else had heard it. I know all of this because Joe Garcia told me, 6 weeks later, sitting on the tailgate of my truck outside the diner on Route 14. Joe was calm when she told me. She's always calm. She's the kind of person who processes things slowly, carefully, and only speaks when she's sure of what she's saying. She was sure of this. She'd gone over it in her head 100 times, and the story didn't change, and the details didn't soften, And the thing that happened on the third night was still the thing that happened on the third night, no matter how many times she replayed it. The camping trip was Tanya's idea. She'd found the spot online, Pine Notch, a backcountry site in the Grafton Wilderness, 8 miles in, no reservations, first come, first served. The listing said it was remote. It didn't say how remote. 8 miles doesn't sound like much until you're walking them through forests so thick the GPS loses its fix and the trail markers are faded pink ribbons tied to branches that may or may not lead where you think they lead. They went in late September, the 4 of them. The air was cool and sharp, tinged with the sweet rot of fallen leaves and the clean bite of pine resin. The trail climbed steadily through hardwoods, beech and maple, their leaves turning copper and wine, and then dropped into a valley where the hardwoods gave way to white pine and the ground went soft with needles. The pines were tall, 80, 90 feet. Their trunks were straight and limbless for the first 40 feet, like columns in a building designed by something that valued height over warmth. The canopy was high and dense, and it turned the afternoon light into something gray and underwater. Pine Notch was a flat clearing in the valley, ringed by the white pines, with a fire pit dug into the center and a creek running along the eastern edge. The creek was narrow and dark and quiet, not rushing, not tumbling, just moving, the way blood moves through a vein. The water was cold. Tanya dipped her hand in and pulled it back and said it felt like snowmelt, even though the nearest snow was months away. They set up camp. 2 tents, 4 women, a cooler full of food, a bottle of bourbon that Mel had brought as a surprise. The first night was good. They built a fire. They ate chili from a pot. They drank bourbon and talked about men and jobs and the particular exhaustion of being 26 and still not knowing what you wanted. The fire cracked. The pines swayed. The stars were visible through gaps in the canopy, bright and cold and indifferent. Mel didn't mention the voice until the next morning. She told Tanya, quietly, while Joe and Sarah were at the creek filling water bottles. She said she'd heard someone calling her name from the woods. She said it sounded exactly like her. Tanya listened and said it was probably an echo, sound bouncing off the ridge, distorted by distance and trees. Mel wanted to accept that. She almost did. The second night, she heard it again. This time, it was closer. Not 100 yards, maybe 50. And it wasn't just her name. It was a sentence. It was her voice saying, "Mel, come here." Clear and calm and conversational, as if she were standing just beyond the firelight, asking herself to step into the dark. She told the others. They went quiet. Tanya picked up the flashlight and aimed it at the tree line, and the beam cut through the dark and found nothing. Pine trunks, shadows, the faint glint of the creek. No person, no animal, nothing that could have produced a human voice. Joe said it was a bird. Some birds can mimic speech. Everyone knows that. Mel nodded. It was a bird. It was definitely a bird. But birds don't know your name, and birds don't use your voice. The third day was cloudy. The sky pressed low on the valley, and the air was damp and heavy and smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. They hiked north along the creek, through the pines, into a stretch of forest that got progressively darker and quieter. The pines were bigger here, trunks 5, 6 feet across, bark furrowed into deep channels, roots humping out of the ground like the backs of buried animals. The ground was soft. Each step left a print that filled in slowly, the needles settling back into place like water closing over a stone. About 2 miles north, they found something. It was a clearing. Not a natural one. The trees stopped in a rough circle, about 30 feet across, and inside the circle the ground was different, The pine needles were gone. The soil was bare and dark and compacted, pressed smooth, as if heavy foot traffic had worn it down over years, decades, maybe longer. In the center of the clearing there were stones. Not a fire ring, not a cairn, just stones. 8 of them, arranged in a pattern. 2 parallel rows of 4, spaced evenly, about a foot apart. They looked like they'd been there a long time. Moss on the tops, lichen on the sides, settled deep into the earth. Tanya said they looked like a path, a very short path, leading from one side of the clearing to the other, from north to south, from the deeper forest toward the camp. They didn't stay long. The clearing felt wrong. The air inside it was colder than the air around it, and the smell was different. Not pine, not earth, but something flat and mineral, like the inside of a church or the air above a quarry. The silence inside the clearing was total, not just quiet, sealed, as if the space had been cut out of the forest and the forest couldn't get back in. That night, Mel heard the voice again. This time she wasn't the only one. They were all by the fire. The clouds had broken and the half-moon was up, and the pines threw long, thin shadows across the clearing. The fire was low, embers more than flame. And from the north, from the direction of the clearing with the stones, they all heard it. Mel's voice, saying Mel's name. Not shouting, not whispering, speaking in a normal conversational tone, the way you talk to someone sitting across a table. "Melanie, come here. I want to show you something." All 4 of them heard it. Joe was sure. Tanya was sure. Sarah, who had been skeptical all weekend, stood up from the log and her face was white, and she said, "That's your voice, Mel. That's exactly your voice." They stared at the tree line. The voice came again. "Melanie." Patient, calm, not insistent, just present, like it had all the time in the world. Then another voice, from the same direction, the same distance. But this one wasn't Mel's. It was Sarah's. Sarah's voice, saying Sarah's name in the same calm, patient tone. "Sarah, come here." Sarah sat down. She sat down hard, as if her legs had given out. She looked at Mel, and Mel looked at her, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say. Their own voices were calling them from the dark, from between the pines, from the direction of the clearing where the stones lay in their short, deliberate path. Then Joe heard hers. Josephine. Her full name, the one nobody used, in her own voice, shaped by her own mouth, coming from a place she couldn't see. Tanya didn't wait to hear hers. She stood up and said, "Pack, now, everything, we're leaving." They packed. It took 8 minutes. The voices continued the entire time, overlapping now. 4 voices calling 4 names from the dark forest, patient and calm and relentless. Mel's voice calling Mel, Sarah's voice calling Sarah, Joe's voice calling Joe, and then, as Tanya was zipping the last bag, her own voice, coming from between the trees, soft and clear. "Tanya, come to the clearing. It's almost ready." They hiked out in the dark, 8 miles. They used headlamps. They moved fast. Nobody spoke. The voices followed them for the first mile, fading gradually. And by mile 2, they were gone, and the forest was just forest again. Dark and cold and full of normal sounds. Wind and water, and the small rustles of things that belonged there. They reached the car at 3 in the morning. They drove south. They didn't stop until they hit a gas station with fluorescent lights and a bored clerk and a coffee machine and the blessed, ugly normalcy of a place built by human hands for human reasons. Jo told me the story in October. She was calm, she was precise, she left nothing out. I asked her what she thought it was. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she didn't know, but she'd been thinking about those stones, the 2 rows of 4, the short path from north to south, from the deep forest to the camp. She said it looked like a walkway, a threshold, a door that something was building stone by stone, and when it was finished, whatever was on the other side would be able to walk through. She said the stones had been there a long time. She said 8 might not be enough. She said the voices were practicing, and I asked her what they were practicing for. She looked at me, and her eyes were steady and clear and afraid. She said, "Learning how to sound like us, so when they come through, we won't run." Nobody has been back to Pine Notch. The listing is still online. I checked last week. It still says remote. It still says first come, first served. But I noticed something in the reviews that wasn't there before. A review from 3 weeks ago, from a username I don't recognize, posted at 2 in the morning. It says, "Beautiful campsite, very quiet, felt like we had the whole forest to ourselves." It says, "Almost ready."